In this video, I'm going to be showing you how I made my basic set of accessories for my workbench. So I have a planing stop, a bench hook, a 45-degree shooting board, a 90-degree shooting board, a set of bench dogs, 2 wooden holdfasts, some doe's feet, and some Vise shims. So the first thing I was going to do with this is add the vise I had onto the end of the bench. And it's not a super high quality vise, but it is what I have, and I think it will work for the type of furniture that I build. So in order to attach it, it had to be shimmed, and this actually worked out pretty well for me because I had that little lip on my bench, and if you used a higher ended vise, I probably would have had to make that end flush. So after I had that shim that put it at the right height, I was able to make the stock for the jaws, and I'm going to be really stretching the capacity of this vise by making really long jaws in order to utilize those bench dog holes I drilled. So the stock I used for the front was, I think it was 3/8 inch oak. I just had it in my shop and that's what I used. And then for the one in the back, in order to put dog holes in it, I ended up using some yellow pine. Ideally I would have used a hardwood, but I didn't have any on me, and these pieces are pretty easy to make, so if it ever starts to wear, I could just replace it. Then I just marked where this would line up with those holes, and I drilled 3/4 inch holes in order to receive those bench dogs. And then this vise is pretty easy to install. You pretty much just put some screws through the back, through the front to attach those 2 slats of wood, and then from the bottom there's 2 screws that go into the bench. There's actually 2 holes in the front that would screw into the lip of the workbench. I haven't used those yet just because in order to get them on there you really kind of need a right angle drill, which I don't have, but it's pretty sturdy as is now, so I probably won't add them unless it really starts to rock on me. And then I just put some 1/4 inch, I think they were 3-inch lags in through the bottom, and it just really shored everything up. And then the vise works fairly well for the quality of the vise. You really have to tighten it pretty severely in order to get it to hold stuff, but once you tighten it, it will hold your workpiece. So then I started some work on some holdfasts, and I am making these out of wood basically to buy me some time in order to find ones I want for this bench. The holdfasts are definitely something that I want to spend the money to get quality ones because they will last forever if you take care of them. And it's not something I wanted to buy on Amazon. A lot of the ones on Amazon don't get great reviews, and they're cast, so those ones have a tendency to break. So I found out that the conduit I had in my shop is a perfect 11/16 of an inch, which is what the holdfast legs are. So I went online and found the angle of the holdfast I think is at 83 degrees. So I just copied that onto a huge piece of stock that's oak. It's the same oak I made the hook out of for the end of my bench. And I kind of was using some measurements I found online, using some other measurements, and came up with this design. And the first one didn't really work out because I drilled an angle for the conduit to go into, when in actuality on the second one I found out that if you drill that hole straight it works out perfectly. I was able to fix the first one and make it work, so I had 2, but if you want to make something like this, I'm not going to put measurements or anything in the video because I don't think they're super durable. They're working for now. I don't think they're going to last forever, and it's not really something I would recommend making. Like I said, I made them just to buy me some time because I needed something before I get real metal ones. But if you do want to make these, you put a comment in the descriptions, maybe with your email or something, I could draw up some rough dimensions and send them over to you. So once I had everything cut out, I just shaped it with a flap disc on my angle grinder, and they ended up looking like horse heads, so I kind of accentuated that, and then I just epoxied that conduit into place. Nice 5-minute epoxy gives you a pretty sturdy joint. And then this is the first one. You could see where I messed up. The back and the front should be about the same height off the table. So it worked, but it would only work on super thick pieces of wood, and it does hold it fairly well. I'm really tugging on it and it still holds it. So for the second one, I copied the shape, but I ended up drilling that hole in the back square instead of at an angle, and that one worked really well. And once you put a little piece of leather on the front, they ended up holding things pretty securely. And then, like I said, they ended up looking like horse heads, so I kind of ran with it. And once they're in place, they do hold things. Probably not as well as the metal ones for sure, but they hold it enough that it won't move around, and you could see they hold the stock well enough that I could plane on it, which is mostly what I would be doing with these Holdfast, which is good enough for me for now. Then once I had these made, I was able to utilize the hook at the end of my bench to plane on the edge of this board, and that also holds everything really well in place, which is going to be just a huge time saver for me. So next up was I wanted to make a bunch of bench dogs, and once again I had a piece of metal that was a perfect 3/4 inch. This was part of a wooden Lazy Susan someone gave me, so the outside of it's a little shiny, which I ended up scuffing up. But I cut that down into a bunch of pieces. I think I ended up with about 15 pieces, and I started with making 4 of these dogs out of solid maple, and then I just have those leftover pieces for making ones down the line if I'm working on curved pieces or whatever. I could customize them, but I started out with 4, so I was just cutting this maple to a rough size, and then I was going to drill 3/4 inch holes in it. Now the reason I was pretty adamant about using metal for the tail end of these as well as the Holdfast is just because my shop, I now have heat in the winter, but I really don't have a way to control the humidity. So in the summertime, especially when it gets really humid, if those holes start to expand, wouldn't be as much of an issue of that if I had used wooden dowels for the ends of these and those dowels started to expand. They just wouldn't fit in those holes properly. So the metal, I had it on hand, which worked out nicely. But like I said, I won't have to worry about that issue as much in the summertime by using metal. And at the same time when I was making the bench dogs, I also was making a planing stop for the end of my bench out of the same material, maple, and this was 3/4 inch maple, so I took about 1/8 of an inch off to make it about 5/8 of an inch, so I could use these stops on any material about 3/4 inches and bigger, which is mainly what I work with. If I have to start planing down thinner stuff, it will be easy just to make another planing stop. And those holes at the end of the table are 10 inches on center, so it was easy to transfer that measurements to the bench, the planing stop, and I just drilled all my holes on my drill press, and then I was going to epoxy those pieces of metal in place. So next up was I was going to make some doe's feet, and when you utilize those with Holdfast, you can pretty much hold anything on the top of that workbench, especially if you're going to be planing a piece and you're not using the plane squarely, you're hitting the piece at an angle, it will keep everything in place. And these were really simple. I made a couple, just like 3 of them, and I had 1/2 inch birch veneer plywood, and you're basically just cutting it down to the size you want and putting a 90-degree angle at the end of it, and then when you use the Holdfast, it will keep that corner square and you could plane away. Next, I was making a bench hook, and most of these measurements came from a book that I was reading, so they weren't made up measurements. They were ones I got out of that book. And for this piece, it was, the recommendation was, I think, 10 to 14 inches long and 6 to 9 inches wide, and I stuck within that window. I already had this piece of cherry veneer plywood that had a dado cut out of the bottom, so I utilized that dado and I made it a little bit wider, and then that was what I was going to use to put the cleat and the top and the bottom for that hook. The nice thing about the dados is not only would it keep the stock in place, but if your miter gauge and your saw are aligned properly, it's going to give you a perfectly 90-degree perpendicular angle to that side of wood, and it just makes attaching all these much easier when you already have that perfect 90-degree, because if these are off, then anything you saw on here won't work. So once I had those grooves on both sides of the piece, I just put a little bit of glue in there, and the cleat for the bottom is just a piece of pine. I wanted it thicker so it could really hook on the edge of my bench, and then the piece for the top was a piece of maple I had, and then I just found center and screwed all this together. So you could use this in a vise in order to hold everything flat. You could use it really on the edge of your bench to hold things flat. And this saw has a couple missing teeth, which is why this was hard to cut. But now it's a nice place to hold stock while you make cuts with a handsaw. And I don't use a ton of hand tools in my work, especially for customers. It's just not cost effective. But sometimes they're just applications you need. So all these tools will be super helpful. So the next one, I don't actually know if there's a proper name for it, so I'm going to be calling them Vise shims. And I've seen this done a couple times in different places, and this is kind of my take on it. So I had this, I think it was a little bit thicker than 1/8 inch plastic masonite, so it had a coating on it. It wasn't quite like melamine, it was just masonite with this white plastic coating, and since they were about 1/8 of an inch, I could get multiple sizes out of it if I made it into a block. So the stack I ended up with was about 2 inches. So I just kind of cut these pieces to rough sizes. I think this was 4 inches by 2 inches. I taped it all together and then drilled a hole through it. So once I had this, I could utilize it in my So then I just put a screw through there, and now you have a block that you can make multiple thicknesses. So on vices, especially cheaper vices like mine, if you're trying to use just one end of it, it won't tighten because of the way the threads are aligned. So if you have that vise shim on the other side, you could use it to make the same thickness as what you're trying to clamp in place, and if you tighten it pretty securely in the style vise I have, it will hold it in place. So for the workbench, I pretty much picked the pieces that I would think utilize the most right off the bat. You could spend a week making accessories for these workbenches, but I kind of picked the heavy hitters and ones that I have been wanting for a while. So the last ones I'm going to be making for this video are 2 shooting boards, one that's going to be a 90-degree shooting board and the other one a 45-degree shooting board. So I had these pieces of plywood that someone had given me. They already had some sort of shellac on them, which was nice. I wouldn't have to coat them afterwards. And once again, I pulled dimensions out of a book, and the base of these is 24 inches by 9 inches, and the top is also 24 inches but by 6 inches. So I had my 2 stacks after that, and then I drew a mark because I'm going to be putting a groove in there, and my camera didn't film me cutting it, but that groove will keep chips away when you're using your plane. So I also didn't film this, but I sanded those 2 pieces where that shellac was so the glue would set, and then I put it on there pretty squarely, And unfortunately with glue, a lot of the times if you're trying to tighten stuff with clamps, it wants to move around on you. So I got everything square and then just let it set up for a little bit before I flipped it over and countersunk some 1¼ screws into the bottom. Once I had that, the process for making the 90-degree shooting board is almost identical to making the bench hook. So I put a dado on the bottom for the cleat that clamps onto the bench, and then I will cut a dado onto the top for the cleat for holding your workpiece. And the 45-degree one, I also put a dado on the bottom because that would be similar, but for the top you're going to be mitering some stock in order to get those 45 degrees. And then for that top piece and the bottom piece, I was using some poplar that I had lying around the shop. So like I said, once I had those two dados, I checked for square and they ended up being perfectly square because I made sure that my miter gauge was cutting at 90. It just makes life a lot easier doing it this way. So then I screwed those in place and this one would be ready to go. To make the stock for the 45, I set my miter to cut at that 45 and then just ran a scrap piece of that plywood through. These measurements didn't really come from a book. I just made them to fit the size of stock I was using and just kind of eyed what I wanted. And then once again I put that cleat on the bottom, and then for this one I had the same problem with the putting the tops on, where even though I had sanded that shellac off, it wanted to move around a bit. So I just sanded that shellac off, put some glue on there, and then I let it set up for about 20 minutes till it was fairly solid, and then put some screws in the top as well. And I was obviously checking this with my squares to make sure that it was aligned properly, because if these aren't at 45 and if the other one isn't at 90, then the shooting board won't have the results that you're looking for. Then I finished all this stuff fairly late in the day, so I don't have footage of using it, but I'll be using it in future builds.